Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the Ultimate Doctor Who Marathon. This is the show where we look at every classic Doctor Who story, plus a bunch of big finish audio dramas, one episode a day, 7 days a week, and today, on the 3rd of November 2019, I'm starting to look at the third televised Peter Davison story, and oddly enough, one of my favorite Peter Davison stories, Kinda, starting with Part 1. Now, Kinda Part 1 starts off, I think it's important to note who the writer of this story is. The writer of the story is Christopher Bailey, who was kind of a reclusive person. He pretty much spent a lot of his life living on his own. He wrote for Doctor Who, and I'm not sure if he wrote for much else. He wrote 2 stories for Doctor Who on television, and then had one of his submitted scripts that was rejected adapted for the Lost Stories range, which we will be covering later in the marathon, of course, when we get to it. But Kinda is his first story, and it is, what's interesting is that Nyssa does not really appear in this story. She's there at the beginning, but the idea is that they put her asleep in the TARDIS for the story, which is, I think that's basically because they weren't, partially because they weren't certain if they could keep using Nyssa. This story was written, I think, with only Tegan and Adric in mind. It was written, I think, while season 18 was in production, so they needed to get rid of the character quick. So Nyssa sadly fell by the wayside. She apparently needs 48 hours of rest using a delta wave augmenter, which is basically a sci-fi gadget to ensure she has, to ensure she receives some good sleep. Now that is, that's a perfectly fine way of writing around. I won't fault the episode for that. That kind of explains what the end of Forward to Doomsday was all about, because the end of Forward to Doomsday just sort of comes out of nowhere and is like, oh, surprise, Nyssa fell over. That's a thing. But, so Sarah Sutton really isn't in this story. This story takes place on this planet, Deva Loka, which is, it's inhabited by a race, at least in the first episode, they're silent, and they're called the Kinda. That's what the title of the story refers to. And what's interesting is that, a lot of this first episode, there's this Earth ship that has an Earth base that has made landfall on the planet and has set up shop, and they're basically scouting to see if this planet is suitable for colonization. Now, what's interesting is that this is a story that is using science fiction to tell a message. Yeah, this is a story essentially critiquing the sort of British colonial system. You see that through the character of Sanders, who is this older man, played by a veteran British actor, who basically he represents, I guess, sort of old-fashioned values. He believes that the native inhabitants on this planet are primitive. He even says at one point, if they are so technologically advanced, why haven't they come and conquered us? They're uncultured, they're primitives, they can't even speak. Which you kind of get hints at that's not entirely true. But you sort of have this man. He's going out, and he basically in this story he leaves the base in this machine. After the rest of his crew having gone out and some of them and disappearing in mysterious circumstances, there's a mysterious character called Roberts who we never get to see, we never get to hear from. He's just gone missing. He's a character who has disappeared into essentially into the night of this planet, which is kind of a paradise. And basically, he's sort of the old guard. Like he's taken 2 of the native people captured because that's standard procedure, even though it's something completely inhumane. And his science officer, Todd, played by Naris Hughes, is basically sort of representing sort of the changing attitudes. I think it's partially represented to the fact that Todd is a female character. It's, this female scientist from the future, believing, no, the Kinda, the Kinda seem to have some intelligence. They all wear these sort of necklaces that they look like the double helix, and it kind of, specifically the double helix of DNA, like with base pairs. It's not in sort of an artistic type representation. This was released in 1982. They didn't have, the best, they didn't have everything we know about DNA now. They had most of it, but, they had the idea of the double helix, and Todd's also a character who bends the rules. She brings in some fruit, and she doesn't like having to have these hostages, but she can't let them go, sort of for fear of losing her position. And she and the Doctor actually have some really, really good chemistry. Peter Davis and Naris Hughes are really fun to watch play off of each other as they sort of banter and just sort of show that, yeah, they both sort of have gotten the role. And there aren't as many issues in this as there were in Forge Doomsday, where you had the cast feeling like they didn't like each other. No, this one feels better. Like, the Doctor, there's a point where he specifically chides Adric for basically, for basically wandering off and, messing around with this wind chime type structure that has a sense of musicality. Like when you strike the wind chime, notes are produced, and they're very, very interesting notes. They're specifically kind of they're made with a synthesizer, so they're specifically just sort of, it gives it this sort of otherworldly and weird feel that may be slightly dated, but it's still weird enough. And Adric is interesting because he spends the episode sort of sympathizing with Saunders, but not entirely. He suggests an alternate solution that, maybe it's not the indigenous life forms who you say aren't intelligent. Maybe it's that your machine's broken down. And that's what Adric does in this story. But there's also, now Tegan's arc in the story, I'm not going to talk about too much for this episode because it just gets started. I will say she falls asleep by the wind chimes, and we basically get this really cool artistic shot of zooming in on her eye, as it seems that she's like trapped in this sort of dream world, represented by a black void, which gives and by just a world of shadows, which is very evocative. It's a very evocative way of doing a dream world, but also just it's a very effective way of doing it as well. And she sees these people playing chess, and they have snake tattoos, and this other and this younger gentleman comes to her and says, basically gives her the ultimatum, you'll agree to being me, whether you're on this side of sanity or the other. There's some great lines just throughout this sequence of Tegan. The sequence doesn't conclude. Her story is just starting, so I'm going to talk a little bit more in part 2 about what the entire sequence sort of represents, because it's very much an allegorical sequence, with all the characters being taken from certain Buddhist terms, and sort of represent, and a lot of things from this story itself being sort of Buddhist in nature. But you also have the third member of the sort of crew, Hindle, played by Simon Rouse, who is great. He plays this role like he's right there on the edge of a nervous breakdown, and the viewer almost knows, like, yeah, he's going to be losing it. Because Todd, because then Sanders just puts him in charge, now that he's like head security officer, while Sanders goes out, which is just this very unsafe thing, and Hindle just lets the two Kinda out, shows them a mirror, and it all done through this amazing artistic sequence. The direction of the story was done by Peter Grimwade, and he is great. But like they become his almost servants, and then he throws the Doctor and Todd with the gun, and that's where the episode ends. So you have a lot going on in this story, and a lot of it is kind of disparate, but thematically it meshes really, really well. It's not a perfect episode. The jungle set honestly is pretty weak. It doesn't look great, and it wasn't like it was on location or anything. But overall, this is a good start to the story. So I'm going to give Kinda Part 1 a 9 out of 10. Alright, it is the 4th of November 2019, and I just finished watching Part 2 of Kinda, the second episode of the story, which builds things up. It builds things up not towards it builds a lot of the allegory up, and it starts to peel back some of the layers on the mystery of just this planet and all these people, and it starts to give the viewer something to almost identify with. First thing I'd like to discuss is Tegan's story arc. Tegan's story here is all about. So this is the episode where we actually get to understand what the boy in Tegan's dream wants. He wants control of her body for potentially nefarious purposes. Now, he later calls himself Amara. Now, which is actually a word essentially meaning evil. If the whole manipulation of Tegan into insanity wasn't enough. Yeah, this is a story where Tegan is essentially slow. Episode 1, episode 2, the first episodes of the story basically have Tegan being slowly driven to the brink of madness, all because of this guy's tricks. She gets stuck in this dream world, and then, like, there's a duplicate of her. The duplicate she and the duplicate try to figure out, like, no, figure out which one's the real one, but not actually. They eventually stop arguing and basically try to work together to defeat them, but it's not strong enough. They eventually create 8 more duplicates, and then back down to the original Tegan. And that's when the tactics change, because that's actually, it's more her putting herself back together again isn't really representative of her being strong. It's representative of her overcoming this, but it weakens her, and then she gets left alone, which is quite terrifying. There's also just some stuff about Tegan being sort of reverted to childhood. She remembers not liking the taste of a certain flavor of ice cream, just as a child, which is a very specific type of memory. And as a story, it's a very important sort of point for Tegan, as it then creates this idea of being alone. So then the Mara latches onto that and basically makes her be alone. And that's what finally gets her to break. Something that I think is admirable. Because Christopher Bailey's script does not make Tegan out to be wrong for giving in. The idea is that, it's this small human going up against this cosmic entity, which then emerges and, like, basically then finds a host that would actually then it tries to seek out a host who wants power, because you have this character called Eris, who is one of the Kinda, who is quiet. But the thing about the Kinda is that the females actually, and the wise ones, mostly females, I think entirely females, just represented by this older woman called Panna, played by the lovely Mary Morris, who was one of the number 2s in The Prisoner, and this child, who basically they're basically telling this guy Eris, like, no, you need to calm down. Everything will be okay. And they've basically been responsible for driving the rest of the crew insane with this box, giving it to them, hoping that they'll understand. It's all very much done in allegory, and it's not done whether, like, the men, like the Kinda, they're advanced because they haven't built any structures because they don't need to. They've got they've got, all that they need at their fingertips. So why would they need to build structures? Um, and they've communicated through telepathy. So why would they need speech? It's all little things like this that build up. And you have Eris basically taking the power from Tegan of the Mara, and he gets possessed at the end of this episode. More on him again later, because he then remains possessed for the rest of the story. Now, what you have actually with the Doctor and Adric in the base is just the complete mental breakdown of Hindle, sort of representing sort of this in-between generation between sort of this Victorian colonialism and sort of like the current 80s generation. Like, he even makes the point of like, I was beaten as a child every day and I turned out fine. Mind you, he's gone completely insane. Like, he's put himself to in this position of power, and he's abusing these two Kinda who don't really do anything to stop it, because they believe he's got their soul trapped, which is a rather fascinating thing. But then Hindle snaps as soon as Sanders returns with the box, and you think, like, Todd even thinks, okay, Sanders is back, it's going to be fine, he's going to take control of the situation. Nope, Sanders is gone, just as crazy, which is which is incredibly appropriate, because you have this whole idea that everyone on all sides are mad, and Sanders has brought back the box, and Adric actually plays the going over to the villain's side again card in this story, but here it actually works a little better, because here Adric, because here Bailey makes it clear that Adric is doing it to try to find a way to get the Doctor and Todd out, which he fails, and then he's going to be punished. And then, basically, it was building up to this cliffhanger, this really esoteric cliffhanger that I think works amazingly well. It's just trying to open this box that has driven Sanders mad, and Hindle is just screaming at them. And the Doctor does. We don't see what's inside the box, but it makes Todd scream, which lets the mind fill in the gaps, and does a really, really good job of leaving a cliffhanger on such a note that it's like that you want to come back and see, like, okay, what the hell is the conclusion to this? How are they, like, what is this going to mean? Where's this story going to go? It's something that that Christopher Bailey does an excellent job at writing. He's doing these sort of esoteric cliffhangers that are just sort of different than normal. And I think this is actually the first televised Peter Davison episode that I would give a perfect score of 10 out of 10. Alright, it's the 5th of November 2019. I just finished watching Part 3 of Kinda. Now, Part 3 of Kinda is incredibly important, as it's where a lot of the plot gets explained if you're paying attention. The first thing I want to talk about is actually Peter Grimway's excellent direction throughout the whole of this episode, and just how the cliffhanger resolves itself, and how the cliffhanger resolves itself it's doing it in a non-traditional way that could have easily become a letdown. But you have that perfect cutting of build-up to opening the box, and then there's like quick cut, it opens, and then bam, a little like sort of grass made. It's like sort of it's a little doll that pops out. This completely innocuous thing that sort of just like, oh, you lose your tension, not quite in the same way as a jump scare would make you lose the tension. It's just like, oh, it's mainly because there isn't like some crazy music sting. It's just, oh, it's a little doll. How innocuous. But then the reaction to that from Hindle is where things get great. That it makes Hindle go into a fury, because he basically can't stand people. He's convinced the Doctor that this whole was a trick, somehow by the Doctor, mind you, who has been locked up at this point. Like, this was just a trick to basically. The idea is that it subverts his command, his ability to command and ability to be in charge. Remember, he's sort of representing this sort of maladjusted child, and Sanders is just as insane. But that's when things go weird. Then the lights go out, and that's where you just take a turn into the absolute real surrealism of this story, where the characters just are like, "Hey," that they get like these visions of just the Kinda as people, the forest, Panna and the little girl, and then the doors open, and basically Todd and the Doctor are allowed to escape. Basically, the idea is that they're being beckoned, which is just, it's a great little scene that just does, it's this great example of how to just sort of tell a story with a bunch of surreal imagery. Like, you sort of understand so much about the society that they're mute. There's this like jester character that they like that then like the big middle structure of this episode is the is the whole jester is the scene with this jester sort of like, and the Doctor and Todd basically analyzing the Kinda society, which is fascinating. They make a really good team. Neris Hughes and Peter Davison have really good chemistry, and I can see why Big Finish has recently announced hiring Neris Hughes as a companion for Tom Baker. As you know, she is excellent here, and it shows really truly what this story is good at doing. It's doing, it's doing something absolutely insane, absolutely bonkers, and yet still telling a good story because of it. It's this really, it's this really, really fun adventure tale with a bunch of the characters basically living together, basically sort of doing a bunch of stuff, and creating this sort of identity, and just this whole idea of characters having time to having the time to be with one another, and being interacting and dealing with this interesting situation. Like, the story itself is building up. One, you have an explanation of the Mara as this, which is the sort of entity that sort of traveled into Eris's form, and basically took him over from the inside out. You have the idea of the Mara as this entity that's a dangerous entity, and definitely and something to be feared, which is just one. It's an excellently done aspect to the story, because of the nature of the characters. They are most definitely dealing with the entire society breaking down, and then sort of following Eris because of a prophecy. It's it's basically the idea of having the prophecy fulfilled, so the characters have to kind of become these, basically go over it. And well, this is and you have this cliffhanger of just one. You have Panna dying after another really surreal sequence, basically watching time run out. And I guess the idea is that this is going to be the end of everything. It's a great little it's a great little story that you have that you have the um, um, uh, you have just sort of the idea of the end of everything, and meanwhile you have stuff going on in the dome. You have Hindle once again being uh, insane, totally and completely slowly losing his mind, um, and you really have uh, you have um, you have the sense that everything is going crazy. Like Adric is put into a situation that basically tortures him. Like you have Hindle going on these tantrums and basically building his own little society in this, which is genuinely creepy. It's genuinely, this is just a creepy story without actually doing a horror atmosphere, just because of how surreal it is. So overall, I'm going to give Kinda Part 3 another 10 out of 10. Alright, it's the 6th of November 2019, and I just finished watching Kinda Part 4, the final episode of the story, and the big conclusion where we get a lot of answers, and there is so much that is just really, really solid in this story, and in this episode, that I that that I have to that I just have to praise, because this is Kinda is a story that one, it plays off so well of the um of just really, it's the one that explains what the Kinda is, what the Mara is. It's this giant creature, um, and you see really a lot of dismantling of sort of these tropes and these ideas throughout the uh, throughout the episode. You have this has one flaw. If this episode had have one flaw, it would be the conclusion is poorly realized. Mainly because they use this giant inflatable snake to represent the Mara, um, which is just it's one final effect shot that is just kind of bad. Now it's lessened somewhat by the fact that if you get this on DVD or you get this on Blu-ray, which I'd highly recommend, it's an excellent story. The season 19 and the season 19 Blu-ray is just a good bargain for the full season. You do have the option to change that CGI sequence, that sequence to a CGI sequence, which is infinitely better. But as I'm doing the transmitted versions, you get. I'm trying to watch them in their original. I'm watching them in their in the original format, so the original effects are used and watched. It's which is just sort of a shame, but what are you gonna do? You kind of just have to do what the story wants you to do. That being said, the story itself is also it overcomes a lot of it. You get this amazing idea that these wind chimes are a place basically where people share in dreams, and the idea is that there's this whole running theme that sort of, if characters getting their minds basically taken out of their control. You have that with the character of Eris, who who gets taken over by the Mara, and is is the villain. Tegan gets taken over by the Mara. Hindle and Sanders, who lose their minds, and then Adric, who gets trapped in the TSS machine, which is used to move things, and it's one. It's one of those ideas that I think is done really, really well in the story. You have it's such a fascinating idea of just what the wind chimes are, and that's how the Mara got into the physical reality. Someone dreaming alone, which is genuinely creepy. That like it's this idea of being alone is what sort of causes all this evil. It's being isolated, and that's what the Mara does. And that's also kind of what the Box of Jana does. If you're a man, it doesn't, it basically, it takes you, and you are not necessarily taken over by the box, but you are, your mind is lost by the box. And just the final confrontation of this episode is actually really, really nice before the snake appears, because the Doctor gets to, this is the first time the Fifth Doctor gets to be kind of confrontational, and give us just a glimpse of sort of just how this Doctor still has that authority that the rest of the Doctors do in fact have. Peter Davison's Fifth Doctor does have, the good sense of being the Doctor and being able to stare down a villain. It's really, really nice, and it's if it weren't for the badly realized snake, this would probably be the best conclusion of a televised story for Peter Davison of the three I've covered so far, mainly because it feels like an actual big confrontation with the big bad. I will also say that Simon Rouse's Hindle is great here. Like, he builds this little city, and he's going to blow up the dome, and he creates people, and you just sort of, how insane, absolutely insane the character has gotten, and it just sort of climaxes in this big point where the Doctor and Todd get back into the dome about halfway through the episode, sort of to wrap that up, and get the idea of how the Mara can be defeated, which I will discover exactly. I'll discuss that a little bit later of how it's actually defeated. But he's built these cardboard cutout people, and the Doctor accidentally rips one. Sanders suggests, "Oh, it can be fixed with a bit of glue," and Hindle freaks out and famously says, "It's like it famously utters this line of 'You can't mend people,' just sort of indicating just how far gone his madness has gone. He's convinced these little bits of cardboard are people who have who are they're his subjects. It's very, he's going to blow up the dome, and then Todd's the one who actually saves him by getting to open the box again, which saves him and makes everything right. And then that's where we also get the idea of the Mara is basically the idea that it's this evil that resides in everyone completely amplified into a snake. And the idea is basically that it's defeated. It's defeated by basically being forced to look at itself and just see the continuous reflections in this circle of mirrors. And that's what draws it out and kills it. It can't stand the sight of its own reflection. And I think that is absolutely fascinating and an absolutely excellent way of concluding the story. So overall, I'm going to give Kinda Part 4 a 9 out of 10. And with that, we are brought right back to the end of the story. So we take the scores of the 4 episodes, add them up, and as always, average them out to give Kinda, the third Peter Davison television story, a final score of 9.5 out of 10. Thank you, everybody, for watching this installment of the Ultimate Doctor Who Marathon. This is one of the few Peter Davison stories that are genuine classics, and I highly recommend it. As if you like this video, please leave a like, comment your opinions on the story. Do you agree with me? Do you disagree with me? Let me know. And I read I always read the comments, and I always at least try to respond. And subscribe if you haven't already, and join me next time when we take a look at the 4th television story from season 19 and the first script by Eric Sayward with The Visitation.